Hello, good morning or good evening, wherever on the globe you are. And thanks to Eve for the introduction. And thanks to Thomas for really laying a nice foundation about citizen science and kind of the challenges and opportunities with it. I want to talk today a bit about how in the UK we're trying to improve existing bird monitoring schemes by leveraging more citizen science data and kind of to give you an idea how we assess bird populations in the UK. So how do we do that? The traditional way that most of the British species trends for birds are derived is with a so-called British Breeding Bird Survey. And that's a designed randomized survey. We have about 6,000 randomly selected 1 kilometer plots all over the country. About 4,000 of them are currently surveyed in a given year, and that makes up about 1.5% of the UK territory. So in terms of coverage, it's an immensely high coverage for any biodiversity monitoring scheme. And then we have volunteers that go out twice a year in spring, mid and late spring, and do distance sampling on those plots. They record all the birds that they've seen and heard, and for the standard assessment that we do, we then fit a survey-weighted Poisson GLM to those counts. And because volunteers are not equally available across the country, we have survey strata, and we weigh the observations according to density within a strata. So you can see the strata map on the bottom, and then the actual plots next to it. And there's big differences because near cities we have more volunteers, and so in some areas in the south we have up to 10% sampling coverage, whereas in areas in Scotland and in the uplands, it's more like 1/10%. So there's big variation in that. And then we take those trends, and they're official government statistics, and they go into all sorts of policy making, communication, research. They're used by all stakeholders from all sides of conservation. And that's really nice, but there are limits to this. The way the survey is designed, it's designed for inferences at the national level, so the United Kingdom or the constituent countries. And that's not where all of the conservation and management actions happen. So many of the end users would like smaller area trends so they can inform regional conservation action. And then the other thing is it's designed to capture abundant and widespread species. And so we report currently on about 120 species, but by definition, those species that are of conservation concern often are those that aren't abundant or widespread, and so they're poorly covered by the survey. And so this is where a second citizen science data comes in. And that's our kind of British version of eBird, which we call BirdTrack, and that's an app that came out of a migration phenology study and has turned into a record-keeping app for recreational bird watchers. And it has much less protocol, as Thomas pointed out earlier. So people can choose where they go, they can choose whether they count or just tick. They don't have to record all the species and so on. But it comes with a benefit that it has much more coverage across the country, and there are many more observations every year. And that applies to both range-restricted species. So on the left, you can see the crested tit, which has this insular distribution in the north of Scotland. On the right, you have a species that's widespread but rare, the pied flycatcher. And in both cases, we have about an order of magnitude more locations sampled for these species in BirdTrack than we have in the structured breeding bird survey. Unfortunately, as Thomas said earlier, these BirdTrack observations are not random at all. This is a figure from a great paper that Ali Johnston just published a couple of months ago on the BirdTrack data set, and this is a map of the area around Glasgow, and you can see that the spatial bias of these citizen science, these unstructured citizen science data, is very much geared towards the coast, towards the urban centers, and it's kind of what we find. People go to nice places, people go to places close to where they live. And for trend analysis, what's even kind of makes this worse is that the spatial bias is non-stationary. So the spatial bias is not just urban, but as the uptake in bird track usage has increased, so with the lighter colors are the more recent years here, the spatial bias is increasingly urban. So we have a kind of a really tricky situation in making sure that these data are representative of the population processes that we actually want to look at. And so we try to integrate those two data sets using kind of a conceptual framework that is described in this trends tree paper that Nick Isaac led, where we have this idea that there is an underlying true unobserved species distribution, and then we have two sampling schemes, one where we randomize to randomize counts, get a kind of unbiased abundance data set with standardized effort, but even though it's huge coverage, it's still relatively small sample size. And we have a second biased data set, spatially biased data set, where we have biased site selections, but we get presence absence data in a much higher number of samples. And we combine these two models, and I want to talk about kind of one case study in more detail, where we try to, so can we use these two data sources to derive a trend for a small area? And by small area, I mean something that's smaller than a survey stratum in the BBS. And here we chose the area in the South Downs on the south coast of England. And that's an area that is part of a national park. And we're looking at a farmland bird that is threatened, and we're trying to get an idea of what populations in this area are doing. And the way we fit this is based on a model that Elise Zipkin presented at ISEC in St. Andrews, I believe, or maybe the one before, where essentially we have a latent state model that does a population process. So we have survival and gains determining the number of birds that are unobserved. And we can put all sorts of covariates on those processes, on survival, on gains, on the initial abundances. And then we have two observation models, an N-mixture model for the count observations from the structured survey, and a kind of occupancy likelihood on the detection, non-detection data from bird track. And in this case study, because we stratify the state process by habitat, we hope that we soak up the bias in those strata, and then we fit this using MCMC. And it does a reasonably good job. So first of all, we know from previous work that accounting for effort within these citizen science, unstructured citizen science observations soaks up a lot of the unexplained variance. And so here you can see that kind of list duration and detection probability are linked. And what we get then from this is a trend that is much more precise. So the integrated model is the red trajectories for occupancy and abundance, respectively, compared to what would happen if we only had either of the data sources in black. And we have or quarter the confidence intervals when we integrate the data sources. So we get a much more precise estimate of the population trend. In this case, we can actually, with statistical significance, say that the bird is declining in this area. Before we, like the confidence interval crossed zero, we couldn't say that. And we can stretch this approach to larger areas, to different species. And I'm not going to talk much about this, but we also developed a case study where we looked at an invading species. So it's another thing when a species colonizes, it's initially too rare to be captured by the structured survey. And this works really well. And the nice thing about this particular case study is that we have independent data, and we can see that the integrated model results are actually unbiased with respect to those independent data. And then we also ran a case study to do this for a rare but widespread bird. And that's a pied flycatcher in Wales, where we have a much bigger area, and we have about 1,500, sorry, locations in total that we're modeling this. And again, the model works quite well. We get much higher precision. There are some problems possibly with bias in this one, and we're still trying to work that one out. But I want to take the last minute or so that I have to kind of follow Mark Bravington's advice from his plenary the other day and say, like, we too often talk about the shiny models and not so much the other stuff that goes on. And there's 2 points I want to make. And the first one is citizen science data is really, really sparse. We have many locations that people go to, but most of them are visited only once. And a lot of the modeling software for occupancy modeling and similar things comes from a design survey approach. And I mean, this model that I've been describing is computationally costly in the first place because we have a latent state for every location that we have data for. And if you use traditional kind of site by year by visit occasion arrays, you create really, really huge data structures. And so this is a visit distribution. You can see most sites are only visited once, some are visited very often. And if we were to put this into one of these dense arrays, we get a huge array that is over 99% sparse. And so these dense arrays just blow up memory. NA imputation in JAGs makes it even worse. You have all those parameters, no information on them. And in principle, it's trivial to make the data structures better. And that's what I do. But I'm paid to be a statistician in a pretty large NGO, and many practitioners don't have that knowledge. And I would argue that kind of poorly good models, but that are implemented poorly for these sparse data, are really a hurdle for uptake. And so lots of off-the-shelf occupancy model assumes these data structures, and they simply blow up when you give a citizen science data set to them. And then the very last point, also to pick up what Thomas was saying, is the model is great, but only when you actually have data. And if you look at the same species, I was talking about the corn bunting, but in the north of Scotland, then you can see that there aren't even any citizen science data in the range of the species. So we have nothing to learn from integration when there is no data. And I think this is a really important point. And I think there's been some exciting work recently to look at how we can steer citizen scientists and how they can better realize the kind of marginal value of their visits. And I think that's something we need to like step back when we have these models. They're not a silver bullet, but we still need to think about design and data collection. Yeah, and with that, so to sum it up, while I'm overrunning a bit, I think there's great opportunity in those models, but there are great challenges also, and we need to think about sampling. Always need to think about sampling. Thank you.